Hey guys, JT Shaver here with New Layer, and today I'm taking a break from lights to show you a lens that, as much as I hate this phrase, has kind of been blowing my mind lately. This is the Viltrox 85mm F1.8 Mark II, and it is a full-frame autofocus lens with an insanely low price of just $399. At that cost, I expected this lens to have some major issues, but apart from some tiny nitpicks, I think this might be the ultimate budget lens for portraits as well as some product B-roll. The build quality of this lens is surprisingly good, and it feels less plasticky than a lot of my other lenses. Probably because it's made out of metal, but the overall fit and finish is really polished and nice. I don't think you'll find a better build quality in any lens in this price range. It has one focusing ring that's pretty thick and has some texture to it, and I'd say it's on the slightly tight side, which is what I prefer. It also has no hard stop, so you can turn it indefinitely. Because it's an electronic focusing ring, you have to have your Sony camera set in manual focus mode or it won't do anything. It has no buttons, no switches, and no aperture ring, and obviously, since it's a fixed focal length lens, it has no zoom ring as well. First, let's take a look at the overall sharpness as well as the vignetting at different apertures. Keep in mind that I have the sharpness, the noise reduction, and the chromatic aberration reduction all turned off, so if you do turn those things on, you will get a significantly sharper image. The way I photographed this chart was on my 4K computer monitor because it's higher resolution than my laser printer, so it's not the best scenario, but it's still pretty good, and along with the sample images I'm going to show you, should help you decide how sharp and how bad the vignetting is throughout the aperture range. Wide open at f1.8, I find the sharpness of this lens to be pretty darn good from the center all the way to the edges. There is some sharpness fall off between the center and the edges, but I think you'd be pretty hard pressed to find the difference between this lens and some much more expensive ones. At f1.8 is when the vignetting is at its worst, but that's no surprise, and that's how pretty much every other lens is going to be. Stopping down to f2, the sharpness increases a bit and the vignetting gets significantly better. The edge sharpness and the vignetting gradually improve a little bit more as you go to f2.2, f2.5, and f2.8. The good news is that the vignetting all but disappears starting at f3.5. At around f5.6 is when the edge sharpness starts to match up with the center sharpness, and at f8 or f11 is where the overall sharpness of this lens is at its max. Fully stopped down at f16, there is a tiny drop in overall sharpness, and that's typical of most lenses when they're at their most closed down aperture. One more thing to mention is that this lens maxes out at f16 while some of the others go a little farther, so the Samyang 85mm F1.4 goes to f17, and the Sony 85mm lenses go all the way to f22. There is a little bit of barrel distortion with the Viltrox lens, and I had to manually correct for that with a value of -6 in Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom. It's not surprisingly good or bad, but I doubt Adobe is going to add an automatic correction profile for this lens, but it is easy enough to correct in post. As far as chromatic aberration goes, I would normally put this lens in the average category, but because it is so inexpensive, I would probably up that rating to the above average category. Of course, it's the most prevalent in high contrast parts of an image, but it's not something so bad that you can't fix it in post, and a lot of times you just won't even deal with it at all. I think this is probably the main area where the Sony and other 85mm lenses come out ahead, but it's such a tiny difference that it's not going to matter for most people. The minimum focusing distance for this lens is the same as both of the Sony 85mm lenses at 0.8 meters. Combined with the f1.8 aperture, you can get some razor thin depth of field. I find the focus speed, noise, and accuracy to be just as good as any other lens that I own, and especially with the Sony cameras that have the eye autofocus, you really will never miss focus. I tested this lens doing a baby announcement portrait session for some friends of mine, and I really only had about 10 minutes to work with. I only took about 70 pictures during that session, which is not a lot at all, and I missed 0 due to focusing issues. Missed focus can be a huge bummer when it comes to portrait sessions, especially when you're limited on time and you don't have a lot of pictures to work from. When it comes to video, one of the things you have to look out for with non-cine lenses is focus breathing. And focus breathing is when you adjust the focus and the image seems to zoom in or out. This lens does have focus breathing, but it's right in the range of other non-cine lenses. Another huge plus for this lens is just how small it is. It's very close in size to the Sony 85mm f1.8 at 2mm bigger in diameter and 10mm longer. It's significantly smaller than the Samyang 85mm f1.4, which itself is smaller than the Sony 85mm 1.4 G Master. It's also got a 72mm filter thread size, which is right in between the 67mm of the Sony 85 1.8 and the Sony 1.4 G Master, which comes in at 77mm. I took some sample photos around my house and I did them all at f1.8 because that's pretty much what everyone wants to see when it comes to lenses like this. I find the blur and the bokeh on this lens to be surprisingly aesthetically pleasing. I don't see any smearing or weird faceted shapes, and I've definitely seen much worse from much more expensive lenses. Now, I know f1.4 sounds really tempting, but if you've ever shot with an 85mm lens on a full frame camera, you know that f1.4 depth of field is razor thin. Shooting at 6 feet away, f1.4 would give you a depth of field of just 1.47 inches. Even if you're just photographing a single headshot, that means you won't be able to get the whole face in focus. If you drop down to f1.8, you still only get a depth of field of 1.85 inches, so we're talking about a difference of only 3/8 of an inch. So shooting a normal portrait at 6 feet with an 85mm lens at f1.8, it's still going to be impossible to get the eyes and the nose all in focus. Long story short, I think f1.4 is really overkill in the majority of situations, so the fact that this is f1.8 shouldn't really dissuade you from considering this lens. There are some times when that extra 2/3 of a stop of brightness will come in handy, but especially with the low noise capabilities of modern cameras, it's becoming less and less of an issue. 85mm is known to be a really good portrait focal length for head and shoulders or even full body shots. The lens compression looks really nice and it compresses people's facial features as well to look more attractive, so it's a really good choice compared to wider angle lenses. The other thing 85mm is good for is product B-roll. I typically shoot most of my product B-roll between 50 and 85mm because it does minimize distortion on your product shots. I've owned some really good 85mm lenses in my life, including the Canon 85mm f1.2, 1.4, and 1.8, as well as some of the budget options like the Samyang or Rokinon 85mm f1.4. Those lenses come in at the $2,000 range for the more expensive ones to about $599 to the more budget-friendly options. Like I mentioned in the beginning, the Viltrox 85mm f1.8 Mark II is only $399. For some reason, I find the lens hood on this lens a little harder to get on, especially when I'm putting it on backwards to store this lens, and that is a super tiny nitpick, but I figured it's worth mentioning because there's not a lot of bad things to say about this lens. So if this lens is so great regardless of the price, why would you buy anything else? If you're comparing this lens to the other budget options like the Samyang or Rokinon, the main reason is going to be the f1.4 aperture versus this one's f1.8. But you know how I feel about that. They all have the same features, and I think the image quality on the Viltrox lens is just as good or better than the more expensive lenses. Compared to the Sony 85mm f1.8, this is essentially a copycat lens for $200 less. It might not be quite as good, but it does get you 99% of the way there for way less money. One last difference to mention between this lens and all the other lenses I mentioned is that this one is not weather sealed, so if you shoot in those conditions, it's definitely something to consider. If you're comparing this lens to the Sony 85mm f1.4 G Master, there are some features that lens has that nothing else does. It has a dedicated aperture ring, a focus hold button on the lens, as well as a hardware switch to go from auto to manual focus. The Viltrox lens has 9 aperture blades like the Sony f1.8 and the Samyang f1.4. The Sony G Master has 11 aperture blades, so you're going to get a slightly different shape in the bokeh and maybe a different character in the blur, but that's just personal preference. The Sony 85mm f1.8 is around $600 and the G Master f1.4 is around $1,600 or more. You'll have to decide whether the $200 to $1,200 price difference is worth it compared to this lens. Lenses are typically one of the best investments you can make, so I usually advise to splurge in that category, but In this case, I think it's better to save that money and spend it on something else that will improve your workflow. I'll have links to all the lenses that I mentioned in this video in the description, and they are affiliate links, but it doesn't cost you anything extra, and it really helps me create more videos like this. I do gear reviews and tutorials every single week, so make sure you hit subscribe and follow me on social media so you don't miss the next one. That's it for now, guys. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.